this dangerous place in technology where we know just enough to mess things up. We can edit and hack human DNA. What we don't know, André, is we don't know the implications of what we're doing because science and scientists have yet to fully understand what it means to be human. And one of the places where I think this is coming to light the quickest, and this is how science will learn. Science eventually will have, if science is to remain valid, science has to come to terms with the fact that there is something beyond the human body that is not being accounted for in the scientific models. I'll just say, I grew up in northern Missouri, and when I started school, I had the opportunity to see Albert Einstein's brain. When he died, they took his brain from his body and they preserved it in University of Kansas, and they thin sliced it to see what made his brain so different from everyone else, what set him apart from everyone else. And what they found was it looked pretty much like anyone else's brain, with one exception. His brain had way more folds. When you take all those folds and you stretch them out, it means he had more surface area to his brain. And that surface area is more neurons. Neurons, we now know, are essentially biological antennae. We don't store memories in our brains. We don't store memories of our loved ones in the neurons in our brain. The neurons are the antenna that tune to a very specific place, a vibratory space in the field that scientists now know connects all things. 2012, the scientists at CERN, the superconducting supercollider in Geneva, Switzerland, they announced, yes, there is a field that underlies all existence. Esoterically, we had known that and talked about, and everybody said, well, yeah, sure, there's a field. But the scientific community didn't acknowledge that until 2012. That wasn't that long ago. So there's a field. It is a subtle energy field, and information is stored in that field. Our neurons are the antenna that tune to very specific places in that field. DNA does the same thing. So, for example, when we want to learn something new, if you're trying to learn a foreign language, or I'm a musician, you're a musician, we're trying to learn a piece of music, and we're trying to mimic what somebody else does. And the first few times you do it, you go through the motions and it feels awkward, or you're speaking a foreign language and you're saying syllables that just sound weird. All of a sudden, you wake up one morning and, man, you're thinking in Spanish, you're thinking in French, or all of a sudden you wake up one morning and you're playing like Steve Vai, my hero, on the guitar, and people say, well, what happened in that time? Well, this is fascinating to me. If you watch the time-lapse photographs of neurons trying to connect, neurons are very social cells. They want to hook up, and they're looking for another neuron to hook up with. That doesn't happen instantly. It takes about 72 hours, about 3 days, for the dendrites to connect and find others. So here's what's actually happening. It is the act of you or me or anyone watching this, to learn something new, to become something more, to better ourselves, to become something more in the next moment than we were in the last moment. That drive, that compulsion that we feel is the trigger. It's the command for the neurons to find other neurons to create the antenna that tunes to the place in the field that holds what we're asking ourselves to master. Does that make sense if I say it that way? It's amazing to see this happen. And this is why a lot of young people today, new generations, their parents will say, man, my kids, they're having a hard time learning because things don't come quickly to them. They want to learn right now. And what I say to them is stay with it and allow the process. Give them 3 days. Ask them to stay with it for 3 days and see if it doesn't get better. And it does, whether you're trying to learn math, science, art, music, a language, whatever it is. So this is important. We need our biology to connect to the information in the field. Divinity is part of that information. I think beyond any reasonable doubt, what the physics is showing is that we are in a virtual reality. We're in a simulated experience. Or Stephen Hawking, before he died, this was his last quest. He wanted to know if we are living in what he called a base reality. Is this the reality, or are we a spinoff of a base reality that's happening somewhere else? It was Nick Bostrom, 2001, put together the first algorithm, plugged in a lot of variables, and to determine what are the odds that this is a virtual reality. And the bottom line is the odds are much greater than not that we are living in a simulated reality. In 1990, I was hiking through a remote area in northwestern New Mexico, Chaco Canyon, in preparation to lead a group. I was doing a reconnaissance trip. And I was hiking on a remote trail, and there was a native man by himself who was hiking in the opposite direction. And he stopped, and we talked for a few moments. And he began to tell me a story. And the story is pertinent to this conversation. He said, a long time ago, the people of the earth remembered who they were, and they lived much closer to the earth. They were much happier, of course. And he says something happened, and even the elders don't know what it was, but the people of the earth began to forget who they are. But they so long for the deep connection that they had between themselves and the forces of nature and the cosmos and the earth under their feet. They so long for that connection that they began to build in the world outside of them reminders of what that connection meant in the world inside of them. And he said, we live in that world today. We long for that connection. We miss ourselves, our true potential. And he said, we'll keep building stuff. We'll clutter our world with gadgets and machines and devices that continue to mimic and reflect back to us who we are, until one day we wake up and we say, oh my God, that's us. And then we will let the external technology go, because we will have remembered to awaken our inner technology. The world becomes more sophisticated because we've awakened, yet it looks simpler because the external clutter goes away. And that man remains a friend today in one of the pueblos in northern New Mexico. But I think his story, and from his perspective, it gives us a deep insight maybe into why we are where we are in the world today. We are reaching this convergence point. We can all feel it. It's like a rubber band. It's just stretched so far. Something's going to give. And in probably many different ways, many things are going to give because it's unsustainable. But part of that is we're beginning to come back to ourselves and to understand who we are and what our potential really is. And that we are more than the machines that we have built, more than the AI, more than the computer chips. And so this is a decision now that we have to make as a society. Are we willing to give ourselves away to the efficiency and the speed of a computer chip at the expense of losing the power of human emotion, of losing our ability to have empathy and sympathy and compassion for another being? Are we willing to trade those things in for efficiency and speed? And that's a question we have to answer as a society.
You opened up a lot of avenues and a lot of doors of where we're currently going with this exponential rise of technology, of doing it to a degree where we might not understand the effects that it's having to our human divinity and a lot of these aspects which people would see as superhuman that we have on demand within us. And so I just want you to reflect, if you will, a little bit more about the story that we're telling ourselves about what is coming.
When you talk about the people developing the technology, and I used Ray Kurzweil as an example. I've worked with a lot of these people. I haven't worked with Ray, but I've worked with people like this. And they're techies, and this is it. And they're in their element what they've been given is permission to push the boundaries as far as they can, and given the funding and the technology that allows them to open those doors. Now, I have had conversations with them, and I'd say, well, what does this mean for society? What does it mean for a family? What does it mean for a human walking the earth? And here's what they'll tell me. They'll say, don't ask me that question. It's above my pay grade. Say, I'm not paid to think about the social implications. I am paid to push the boundaries of this technology. Somebody else will figure that out. Well, those techies now are running a lot of the policies that we're being asked to embrace with no thought of the social or the moral implications or the lasting implications, without the recognition of just how delicate of a balance our genome really presents to us. And once you tweak that genome in very, very specific ways, which we can now do with, you mentioned it, CRISPR gene editing, you can't unedit. You can, and it's a big process that I don't think you can go back in a species once you make those changes. So yeah, I think a lot of it is the technology. I'll just encapsulate it this way. The technology has developed faster than the morality of how we use it in our lives, or what it means in our lives. And I think it's a very fair statement to say. With your permission, now, can we go into something really deep and esoteric? Are you okay if we do that?
I don't know. It's not really my avenue for this podcast.
All right, well, we don't have to if you don't want to.
I'd love to. Please, let's continue deep diving.
Well, I think one of the reasons, and this isn't new, for generations now, since 1859, Charles Darwin put forth a theory that we called the theory of evolution. In his book, Origin of Species, it was published in 1859. It was a different world in 1859. It was before my time. I certainly don't remember that.
You're timeless, Gregg.
But I've got a really interesting story to tell about, I published a book a few years ago, and I did a radio interview, commuter traffic interview in New York City, to promote this book. And it was all the evidence that does not support evolution. So the interviewer came on in the morning, and man, there was, no good morning, welcome, Gregg. How are you? A 6 a.m. interview for me. It was, commuter traffic in New York. I live in the Mountain States, so it was 8 a.m. for them. And the first thing he says, what gives you the right to talk about evolution and biology? And I said, I thought he was kidding. I said, excuse me? And he says, you're only a geologist. What gives you the right to talk about biology and to question Darwin's theory of evolution? And then I knew he was serious. And I said to him, my brother, do you know what the profession was of the man who developed the theory of evolution? Do you know what Charles Darwin's profession was? And he said, no. And I said, he was a geologist. And he came back, he said, okay, let's go to break. And he took a break and he never came back. So that was the end of that conversation. The point is that Darwin, where I think Darwin made the mistake, was he took what he saw with one form of life, one species of birds, in one location of the Galapagos Islands, in one moment in time, 1853, and he took what he saw happening there and generalized it for all life at all places throughout all time, including humans. So I want to be very clear that as a geologist, evolution is a fact. I've seen it in the fossil record. I have excavated those fossils when I was in school. And I believe in the theory of evolution. It breaks down when it comes to humans. Something happened to us that's not accounted for in our study of evolutionary biology. It happened 200,000 years ago when the first anatomically modern humans is what they're now called. AMH is the acronym, anatomically modern humans. When the first AMH emerged on our planet, we now have the ability to extract the DNA from fossilized remains of ancient forms of life, including forms of life that we used to think were our ancestors. And when you compare their DNA to ours, now we know that we did not descend, for example, from Neanderthal. We may have some Neanderthal DNA. Some people do, especially in Northern Europe, because we shared the earth with them. We walked the earth with them. They say we probably had Neanderthal boyfriends and girlfriends. We interbred. I was a program not long ago, and I made that statement. There was a woman in the front row, and she said, I still do. I still have a Neanderthal boyfriend. And then the guy next to her wasn't laughing at all. So I got to see the whole relationship workshop, happen right before my eyes. But the point is, we did not descend from Neanderthal. We shared the earth with them. If we walked the earth with them, we couldn't have descended from them. And the same is true for these other archaic forms of life. What the DNA is saying, André, and this is a mind blower because we don't have to speculate about this piece. When you compare our modern genome, you take your blood or my blood and you compare that to the genome developed from the fossilized remains of our earliest ancestors, we haven't changed. We showed up 200,000 years ago. We don't know where we came from. We haven't changed since then. Now, we have obviously changed in consciousness. We have evolved in the way we think. But our biology has not changed. We had all of the advanced neural network and all of the ability to self-regulate and all the things that our divinity was available to us 200,000 years ago. The way that it happened, scientists now know this, but they don't know what to do with what they have found, is that there were mutations in our DNA that cannot be accounted for under natural circumstances. They don't happen in nature. Human chromosome 2, it's the second largest chromosome in the human body, in the cell. It has about 1,200 genes in that chromosome. Genes are little segments of the DNA. The chromosome is the long strands of DNA, and then the genes are the shorter segments of the DNA. One of those genes is called TBR number 1. TBR 1 is responsible for our brain size. We showed up 200,000 years ago. We got a brain 50% larger than our nearest primate relative. Boom, just like that. It didn't happen slowly, gradually over a long period of time. With a neocortex, I know you've had my brother Joe Dispenza on before, and he talks a lot about neuroscience and the neocortex. The mirror neurons that allow us the ability to envision in our mind an image of what we want to happen in our bodies, and then the mirror neuron feeding the brain and informing the body to produce the chemistry to match what we're seeing in our mirror neurons. That happened 200,000 years ago. Now, some other forms of life have to a lesser extent that, but not like we have. So human chromosome number 2, where did it come from? Well, scientists now know it is the fusion of two existing chromosomes. They're fused, on a typical chromosome, and I know a lot of our viewers know this, on the ends of the chromosome are the telomeres that protect the vital DNA information in here, because when the cell divides and the chromosomes split, that's a trauma to that chromosome, and part of the chromosome does not make the split. You don't want that to be the good stuff in here, so nature gives us this buffer on the ends called the telomeres. When the split happens, the part that doesn't make it is not that vital because it's on the ends. Well, here's chromosome number 2. What we see is there's telomeres on the ends of the chromosome, and there's telomeres right in the middle, because it was originally two separate chromosomes that were fused. So now you've got telomeres where they should never be, in the middle of the chromosome. That doesn't happen in nature. But it didn't stop there, because once that fusion happened, there was redundancy in the functions of the chromosomes. So some of the chromosomes were turned off, some of them were silenced, some of them were moved, some were added to stabilize this. This can't happen in nature. We didn't know what that meant until gene editing occurred, and it appears that a gene editing happened 200,000 years ago. And if it was only chromosome 2, you could say maybe it's a fluke, but it's not. Our ability as a musician, I've always had the question, we share 98% of our DNA with a chimp, for example, 98%. But chimps can't sing. You know, I've always wondered, I mean, you're never going to hear a chimp sing Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. And if you do, let me know.
Yeah, it definitely will.
Yeah, no, it can't happen. And here's the reason. Because chromosome 7, when you look at primates for about 175 million years, I think that number is accurate, chromosome 7 was stable, no changes, 175 million years. All of a sudden, there was this little tweak of 2 genes that were switched around. And when that switch happened, it gave us the ability, it connected our tongue and our brain and our mouth in a way that gave us the ability to have complex speech and to sing. Guess when it happened? Just
200,000 years
exactly
ago.
200,000 years ago. And there are other things that happened as well. These things, they didn't happen slowly, gradually over a long period of time, and they typically don't happen in nature. So we begin to see that the odds of this occurring are so small that scientists say it appears that there's been an intervention. That's the word that they use. They don't say who or what, but there's been some kind of an intervention. There's a reluctance in the scientific community traditionally to do the latter. Where the information, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more deeply, where that information is leading takes the scientific community to a place that they are traditionally not equipped to deal with, and so they prefer to avoid it. They're not bad people. I have friends in academia, and I've asked them the question. They say, why can't you teach this to your students? And they're the age I am. I'm 70. So they've been teaching, 40, 45 years. And what they say is, we're going to let the next generation of professors deal with this problem. We would have to change all of our class notes. It makes us look wrong as professionals to have to go back and change the story. And I tell them, I said, no, it actually validates the power of science because it shows that science is so relevant. It's made to be updated as new information comes to light. It's a living story. It's not a static story. So for me, once I began to understand on a personal level that the mutations that give us our humanness cannot happen in nature. Of course, that begs the question, how did it happen? And then I began to look at my artist friends. And every one of my artist friends does the same thing. When they create something they're proud of, the last thing they do is they sign it. They put their name on it. And I said, if we are the product of an intentional act, it makes sense that who or what is responsible for us would have left a signature. Where would we find that? And I was asking this question in the 80s and the 90s. We didn't have the internet. Early 90s, we started having the internet. Didn't have computers like we do now. So a lot of what happened was by hand. My sense was it would be in the DNA of all life. And you say, well, how could a message be written in the sticky, gooey stuff inside of a cell? Because that's the way we're taught to think. This is a big story, and I'm not sure even where to jump in. But let me say this. In 2007, Japanese scientists released a report showing that they had stored written information into the DNA of a bacteria. And they chose this bacteria because it replicates quickly, so they could look at hundreds of generations of bacteria and then take that 100th generation, pull the DNA out, and the information was still there. They proved that DNA is a very efficient information storage medium. That was in 2007. The question I had been asking is, did this happen to us a long time ago? And the way it took me 20 years of original research to have the answer that satisfied me, it became a book in 2004 called The God Code, was the name of the book. And the bottom line is this: if you take the chemical codes that make the DNA in our bodies, they're made from elements that you find on the periodic table, and every one of those elements has different ways to represent it. It's got mathematic representations like valence number and atomic weight and atomic mass. Those are all different numbers that represent the same element. Hydrogen, for example. And I began looking at that periodic table and wondering if that somehow would correlate to the ancient languages that have been left for us that tell us who we are. So now I'll shift gears just briefly. There are 4 root or core alphabets that all alphabets are derived from, thought to in one way or another. There were originally 6. 2 of them have been lost. The 4 that remain are ancient cuneiform, ancient Sanskrit, Arabic, that's still used today, and Hebrew, that's still used today. Those are the 4 root languages. One of the great mysteries of linguistics, I'm an amateur linguist, is that every one of the ancient languages has always had numbers that represent the letters. And the science of interchanging those numbers is called gematria. And I want to just make a distinction. This isn't numerology. Numerology is a loose derivative that doesn't follow the rules of gematria. There are 32 rabbinical rules that were laid down in the 2nd century Common Era, CE, AD. They use CE now, Common Era, rather than before and after the death of Jesus. 32 rabbinical rules. And for gematria to be valid, you've got to follow those rules. So I said, if the DNA of our bodies holds a language, is it possible that the numbers could be the common link that would allow us to go from chemicals to letters? In other words, is it possible, can I read the DNA in my body like I read the letters on the page of a book? And the answer is yes. It took 20 years to figure that out. And the information in our DNA is in layers, and each layer has a different code. The first layer is considered as the introduction, just like you would have an introduction into the page of a book. So now what we're doing, André, is we're putting on an IT hat. And rather than looking at biology 101, where you have a cell, and in the cell you have a chromosome, and the chromosomes are made of genes, now we're looking at the cell as a library. What if the cell is a library? And every chromosome is a book, and the genes are the paragraphs and the sentences in that book. And that's exactly what's happened. It's a very different way of thinking. And I caught a lot of heat for it in the scientific community. Once I started talking about this, I lost credibility in some circles. And that's okay, because it's by crossing the traditional boundaries that have separated our way of knowing in the past that we gain new wisdom that leads us beyond the boxes. And so I wanted to go beyond the boxes. So what I did by hand initially was I went through and took all the elements in our DNA. It's primarily hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. This is what we are, different amounts. Hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. I looked at all the numbers that represent those and made a list. About that time, computers became popular, and the human genome was now available on a computer. So I could actually take DNA and look at it, what I'm actually dealing with here. At the same time, I went back into the ancient languages and I looked for a number of the elements that would match the numbers of the ancient language. So I'm looking at the periodic table, correlating it to gematria. And there's only one number that works. It took 20 years to figure it out. And that is atomic mass. The atomic mass of the elements of our DNA correlates to the letters of the ancient alphabets. And here's the beautiful thing, is the message that it reveals is exactly the same in all 4. It's the same in Arabic, the same in Hebrew, the same in cuneiform, and the same in Sanskrit, and probably other languages. But those are the 4 core languages. So when we make that substitution, when you use that numeric link and literally into the DNA bases, cytosine, thymine, guanine, adenine, when you go into those bases and you make those substitutions, it actually spells out the answer to probably the oldest question that we've ever asked. When we say, who are we? The translation of the first layer in the DNA, the introduction of every cell in our body reads exactly the same. And it literally, this isn't a metaphor, it literally reads the words, God eternal within the body. God eternal within the body. And the name of God that's written in our DNA is exactly the same as it's written in the oldest spiritual and religious, our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions. That name is actually written into the DNA of our bodies. So what we can say with absolute certainty is when we forget who we are, when we think our differences are so great that separate us through the attempt to isolate us and break the social bonds, and we no longer know who we are, we need look no further than 50 trillion cells in the human body, and the first layer of every one of those cells that literally says God eternal within the body. It doesn't say who God is, where God came from. And people have said to me, the rabbis came down really hard on me and said, we've tried to keep this secret. What gives you the right to reveal it? And I said, because I'm not a rabbi. And I said, if we were ever going to reveal this to ourselves, what better time than now? When we're on the verge of destroying the very essence of the humanists that we love and cherish. We're on the brink of war. This was in the 80s and 90s, right at the end of the Cold War, another war we were on the brink of. What better time to reveal this than now? And why wouldn't we want to tell ourselves that we are God eternal within the body? We're not some random process, the result of a random mutation, slow, gradual evolution. There's an intentional intervention and a signature to tell us about that intervention that literally says we are God eternal within the body. What does that mean? What does it mean to live your life as God eternal within the body? And what I've found is when people discover this, I see this in live audiences. I watch people's eyes and I can feel the vibe in the room, because now everyone has a challenge in their lives. How does God eternal within the body deal with this disease? How does God eternal within the body deal with the betrayal of the trust? And it's very different than how we're taught to think of it as mere mortal humans, is what somebody said to me once. So that message is only possible because 200,000 years ago, who or whatever intervened to give us our humanness, left a message to tell us. And it's only now, when we arguably are on the brink of global war, this is the year 2024 in the spring, when the technology is being developed so quickly and we're being encouraged to give away our humans and literally replace our bodies with artificial substances and chips and AI and gene therapies, only now that same technology comes full circle and says, this is who you are. Maybe it wouldn't have meant the same thing if we'd discovered it 50 years ago. Chromosome number 2 is the fusion of two pre-existing chromosomes that were in primates here on Earth at that time. They weren't humans. So 200,000 years ago, it appears that the most evolved species on Earth was selected and infused with genetic material from a higher, more evolved species that we call gods, and we are the product of that. We have the muscle strength, and we have the bodies, the physicality, and the sexuality of the forms of life that were here on Earth infused with the DNA. And now bear in mind, the DNA is the antenna. So we are attuned to information and a way of knowing and a way of being that's more than what was ever available and cannot be to those other primates, because their DNA antenna is different. They're tuned in to something very, very different. So we are a hybrid of what our ancestors called human and God, or animal and God, and the product is human. Human is this hybrid. And depending on which text you want to go to, they are, just full of the stories about how this happened from different perspectives, whether you call them the angels from the heavens or the gods from the heavens, and all kinds of stories about that. But they're very clear. And these are the books in the 4th century, the books that were left out of the Christian canon, are called Apocrypha. And these are the books like the Book of Enoch is, for example. Red Wheel Weiser is a publisher that has re-released the Book of Enoch, and they asked me to write the foreword for the new release, and I did that. And the Book of Enoch, it's not an easy read. It's not a long book, but it is a story from the prophet Enoch of exactly what we're talking about, of the angels in the heavens who came to observe and protect, actually were enamored and fell in love with humans. And that was the fall. That was the descent. That was the fall from heaven, and began to procreate with them. And we are the product of that. So when we look at the big picture of light and dark, good and evil, I mean, it just goes so deep into all of this. But that is playing out, I think, in our lives right now. I think whether I had the opportunity in the 1990s, before he died, I toured with Zecharia Sitchin. And he wrote the Chronicles, the Earth Chronicles books. And he talked about this extensively. And I want to be really clear. I think he was an amazing scholar. I don't agree with all of his interpretation from the cuneiform text. He believed that we were created to be a slave species, to do the work, the mining of elements on this planet that were needed by another race. We may have been enslaved at some point in our past. I don't think that's the reason that we're created. This is a very important distinction. I don't think that's why we are as we are. It may have happened to us by those, we may have been enslaved by those who have had power over us. And there are stories about how that happened and when that happened. But this is a fundamental difference between Sitchin and I, is he thought that was the purpose of our existence, and I don't see the evidence for that at all. I think we are so much more than that, and it's a whole deep conversation about why we're created and who we are and what this creation really is all about. But the bottom line for me is that we now have the science that tells us that we are more than lucky biology.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. And now we know there's literally information coded into the DNA of our bodies. What the scientific papers are now saying, once Japanese scientists proved this, 2007, now what they're saying is that DNA is a denser storage medium than flash drive, that it takes no energy to hold the information once it's imbued into the DNA. And as long as one example of that life continues to live, that message remains for thousands of years, millions of years. They're now storing the Library of Congress in the United States into bacteria that is radiation resistant. In the event we ever, God forbid, have a nuclear war, and all of our information is wiped out, if the bacteria survives, and if we have one computer that is preserved that can pull it out, we can start over again. There's a battle It's an ancient battle. Some people would frame it as a battle between good and evil, or light and dark, originally perceived as good and evil. Ultimately, light and dark are simply energies until we give them the significance that we give to them. But there isn't an ancient battle playing out. It's not an obsolete battle. It's playing out before our very eyes today. And it sets the context for every event that is unfolding in our world. And so this is a perfect place to begin. We all know there's a battle for our thoughts. That's obvious. If you watch any network news, we've got commentators trying to tell us what to think and how to perceive the events in our lives. Most people know that. There's a battle for our beliefs. It's been playing out for a while in mainstream classrooms, mainstream textbooks. For example, how did the universe begin? Is it a conscious and intelligent beginning, or is it an inert, dead, random process that we're living in? How did we begin? And we'll talk about this. Are we the product of random mutations and lucky biology, as we're led to believe? Is there something else going on there? Those things are important, but they're all part of an even deeper battle. There is a battle for our very humanness that is unfolding right now. And that the humanness is the vehicle that allows an even deeper experience, André. And that experience, for any of our viewers that may wonder how relevant this conversation really is, there's something deep within each of us that is so powerful, so precious, so sacred, so beautiful, that nations will go to war with other nations to keep us distracted so that we don't know what this power is all about. Armies will defeat armies. Pandemics will be unleashed. We will see the collapse of societies. We will see the collapse of financial systems, all in an effort to keep us distracted from the sacredness of this power within us. So I'm going to use a word and then we'll define it. It is the power of human divinity that is only possible through the biological body. And this is one of the reasons there's such a move to replace our biology with synthetics and artificial intelligence. So the word is divinity. It is divine, our divine nature. Now, when I use that word in public audiences, many people assume it has something to do with religion, and I can see why, because there are schools for divinity where religion is taught. But if you look at the definition of divinity, it's a deceptively simple definition, and it simply says that divinity is the power within us to transcend perceived limitations. And that's it. So I can see where religion would be wrapped around that concept, the idea to transcend perceived limitations. I'm going to break this down just a little bit. The idea of transcendence, it means not just to survive, but to become greater than, to become more than whatever it is that life brings to our doorstep, the challenge that life brings to our doorstep. So our ability to transcend perceived limitations, they may not even be real. They are the limitations that we have placed upon ourselves through our culture and our society, through our textbooks, through false science, through our culture, our religion, but they may not even be real. So our divinity is the ability to become more than the worst challenges that life brings to our doorstep. The reason it is such a powerful force within us is because through our divinity, among the things we transcend is fear. Divinity is what empowers us to transcend our own fears. If we, as individuals and as a society, are not kept in fear, we are very, very difficult to control. Because without the fear, we have the freedom to love, create, innovate, express. These are all features of divinity. I just want to give some examples of what divinity is all about, because for some people it's this esoteric concept. Everyday divinity, we express it every day in our lives. I had the opportunity, 2016, I went to the Grammy Music Awards, and the They held them in New York that year. My wife is a voting member in the Grammys, and she invited me, and I said yes.
It's very kind of her.
It was very kind, and I took advantage of the opportunity, and I met amazing people there. And every opportunity I had, I would ask the musicians and the producers. I would say, when you wrote this amazing piece of music, or when the words for this song came through, can you tell me where did they come from? And every one of them, André, everyone to the T gave me the same answer. Everyone said, it did not come from me. It came through me, from somewhere else. Every one of them said they had to find a way to get out of the way, to allow this deep inspiration to come through them. That is a familiar facet of divinity. Artists say the same thing. If you talk to an artist, who's done an amazing, or a sculptor, or a poet, they say the same thing. As a writer, I have had this experience where I don't know what I'm going to write, and I sit down and give myself the opportunity of either a blank piece of paper, or now it's a blank computer screen, and become very empty so that I can become very full of whatever it is that's going to come through. These are expressions of divinity. Divinity is a part of us. Our divinity is the part of us that's ancient, it's timeless, it's ageless. It is where our creativity, our intuition, our imagination comes from. And it's what sets us apart from every other form of life. And as we get in deeper into the biology of how it works, we can only access our divinity through our bodies, through the DNA antenna of our bodies and the cellular structure of our bodies. There is a movement to replace our bodies, the transhuman movement, to replace our bodies with synthetics, with chemicals in the blood, sensors under the skin, computer chips in the brain, artificial intelligence. And by virtue of doing so, it steals from us our ability to access this part of us, our divinity. So what we're seeing playing out in the world today, whether you're looking at Ukraine and Russia and the role of America, or you're looking at the Middle East, you're looking at Israel and the Palestinian tragedy, that is the horrors that are happening there, and you look at everything happening all around that. People tend to think these are isolated, spontaneous events, and people say to me, wow, isn't it amazing all these things are happening right now? They're happening now because the battle for our divinity has intensified to such a degree that these are the events that it takes to keep us from that inner focus. Now, I'm not saying that everyone, every politician, every leader of every nation certainly is aware of what I'm saying. Many of them are pawns in this ancient battle of good and evil, of light and dark. They don't even know that they're pawns because they're so wrapped up in the bubble of the level that they are playing this very dark game within. But when you begin to step back and you look at the big picture, the evidence supports the story, and it's very clear that this battle is playing out. And the interesting thing to me, when you use the term battle, it's probably no longer even a good word, because in battle, it implies conflict. I believe that we now are at a point in our lives and our consciousness where we have the ability and the awareness to transcend. This is our divinity. If you don't engage in the battle, if you transcend the battle, then that is how not win, but triumph. When we talk about winning and losing, we're stuck in that old paradigm. We don't want to win or lose. We want to triumph, to become more than. And the way that we do this is so interesting to me, is by living the best version of our lives, living the best version of ourselves, fully expressing, perhaps for the first time in human history, what it actually means to be human. And André, what the science is telling us is we don't even know what it means to be fully human because we've never expressed the depth and the breadth of our complete humanness. So as we move through this time in history, there are some that allow themselves to become engaged in the distractions and the diversions, and others who are recognizing it's not that we discount what's happening. And not that we say it's not important, it's all important. But there is a science, there is a skill, and there is an art to rising above, living, becoming the best version of ourselves, and in that way, doing just what the definition of divinity says, transcend our perceived limitations. So I'd like to say this to set the context. Everything we're seeing in our lives today, even the things that so many of my friends, the social justice things that are important and they're really wrapped up in, for example, in the United States, the pronoun conversation, what pronouns are we using, the transgender conversation, abortion conversation, gay rights conversation, all these are important. But if you look closely at what's happening, the races, black against white, Christian against Muslim, Jew against Muslim, the rich against the poor, these are all really important conversations that go right to the gut, man. They cut right to the core of our most primal instincts. And if we don't know how we are being engaged, then we will respond on that primal level. They're important conversations. They have been skillfully weaponized to divide us and keep us separate from one another, to break the social bonds that have always kept families and communities and societies and nations together. There's an intentional effort to break those bonds, and sadly, it appears to be working well to some degree because we're allowing it. We're allowing ourselves to be played, to be pawns in this ancient game. So the conversations are important, and I don't want to diminish the significance of those conversations. It's also important to recognize that the topics have been weaponized, and rather than having conversations in kindness to become closer as brothers and sisters in the global family, the differences that we used to celebrate as our strength have now become the differences that are being used, being weaponized to divide us and keep us in our fear. And it is divinity that allows us to transcend that fear. So when you think about this, all of a sudden it becomes really clear why a dark power would want to keep us in that fear, because we become powerless victims in that fear. And as victims, we need a savior. And technology is now being touted as our savior. We're being told that we are flawed as humans by virtue of our existence. Emotion is one of our flaws. The inability to make clear, logical decisions without having emotion. Empathy is considered to be a flaw by transhumanists. Sickness, illness, death is considered to be a flaw by transhumanists. And we are programming our young people to believe that they are broken and flawed from the time of birth, and that they are victims of something beyond their control. And if you're a victim, you need a savior. And the savior, we're being told, is technology, computer chips in the brain, artificial intelligence, sensors under the skin, AI that knows us better than we know ourselves. And when you begin to understand the big picture, and I'm covering a lot of ground here intentionally because we'll tie into this. When you begin to understand the big picture, all of a sudden, the power of human divinity becomes something more than a casual academic peripheral conversation. It's front and center for everything that's happening in our lives today. And the beauty is you don't have to know that, but you can simply live the best version of yourself.
Gregg, I've been looking forward to this. Happy 2024, your wisdom, your insights, your brilliance, it really is something that I just feel can uplift our world and humanity. And so I'm grateful for you, for your time, for being back here. And just let's getting into this conversation. We were talking before I started to hit record. Thank you for being here, though, first and foremost.
Well, Julie, thank you for having me back. It's the first time you and I have seen one another. New Year. Happy 2024. I think we all feel, and now we're seeing, this is going to be a really extraordinary year. in a lot of ways. Not necessarily a bad year, but I think it's going to be a challenging year because our belief systems are going to be challenged, and we're going to be pushed to the very edge of who we believe we are and what we claim is true in our hearts. And we're going to be pushed to reconcile what we believe in our hearts with what the real world shows us. And I think to some degree it's probably already happening toward the end of last year and then this year, and we can certainly talk about that. So this first time you and I have been together in this program, thank you. You never really know what I'm going to say, so thank you for your trust, number one. And thank you for making the time to share me with your community. That means a lot to me. It really does. And you know, this is unscripted, Julie. We never know precisely where we're going to go. I trust you implicitly. It's a beautiful dance. I'm going to follow the lady's lead wherever the lady leads us, and nothing's off the table for me. I want to say that. So wherever you lead us, I'm really happy to honor our community by talking about things that are real and relevant in our lives. We can talk about esoteric things, and it's interesting. Doesn't necessarily maybe have the relevance in our lives. So I'm going to trust you to lead us wherever you feel your community and my family is best served.
Thank you so much. I feel the same implicit trust. And I will say before we even started, because I know whenever I have a conversation with you, Gregg, it is mind-blowing and expansive. And I said a little prayer and intention, and I just called in, you know, you've written all about the beautiful divine matrix. And I just called in my understanding of this divine matrix. And I just said, please guide this, because there is so much happening in the world right now. A lot of turbulence, a lot of shift. We have an election year here in the States. You know, and I was thinking, I know from so many listeners that write in about this time also in the midst of a lot of challenge and dark times, that there's this desire, you know, to shift our own consciousness and awaken and tap into our hearts and heart intelligence. And I think that might be a good place to start. I know it's a huge question. It keeps coming to me is, how do we do this in a real way when there are all kinds of, you know, challenges and atrocities happening, and an interesting year ahead? Like, where do we start, and how do we do this work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't think there's any single solution. I think there are probably many answers. What I have found in our community, and like you, the end of the year was tough because of what's happening in the Middle East, certainly, and in other places. What's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in our country. You and I live in America, and our country is not the country that we had at the beginning of the year, last year. And we're all seeing, to the degree that we will allow ourselves to see it, we're seeing these changes happen. One of the things I'm seeing happening, Julie, it's a psychological term. It's called normalcy bias. Normalcy bias is when we witness or experience things that are so foreign to our belief system, to our expectation, to our worldview, that we will not allow ourselves to acknowledge these things are even happening. I'll give you a classic textbook example. I'm not saying this is happening now, but if you read about normalcy bias in a psychology textbook, they will give World War II and the Holocaust as an example. In Poland, there were people that saw their friends and neighbors, loved ones, family members take a suitcase. They were allowed one suitcase and board a train. And the story that they told one another to make sense of this is that the people on the train were the lucky ones because they were being relocated to a new city, a new life, new jobs, while the war was being prosecuted in their home. They had heard rumors about the camps, about Auschwitz and Treblinka and the death camps, but their normalcy bias would not allow them to fathom that such large numbers of people could be systematically herded off that way. So they never let that enter their mind. And in a very real sense, it's not on the same magnitude, certainly, but we're seeing a degree of change in the world and certainly in our own country And there's a tendency to overlook it, normalcy bias, to accept and normalize things in our lives that we would never accept and normalize in a million years in a sane world. Indoctrination of our children in public schools in certain ways, healthcare practices, all kinds of things. And what happens, you and I talked about this a little bit before we hit the record button, is when you live in a world and something comes along that is outside of that norm, and in a typical world, you wouldn't accept it, but you do. You go along with it because everybody else is, or we're being, the media says it's okay, or all of our friends say it's okay. And you begin to normalize something in your life that you would never accept in a million years. So now what used to be normal for you here is no longer there. It's over here. All right. So you say, no big deal. Life still goes on. Still got, job, kids are healthy. So now something else comes along. And you do that again, and it takes you from here over to here and from here over to there. Pretty soon you wake up one morning and you are so far away from the norms of what you would want your children to accept and what you'd want to live in your life. And you say, how did we get here? That's kind of what's happening in the world right now. Not just in America. And you said we have an election year this year. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but something is happening on planet Earth that has never happened in the modern world. 40 Western nations are having elections this year. 40 nations are now up choosing new leaders, and there's a tremendous concern among some circles that those leaders going to conform with the ideology moving the world in a direction of centralization and control, or are those leaders going to opt for sovereignty and freedom? And we don't know the answer to that until those elections happen. So it's a big year for the world, not just for America. What I think I'm seeing happen, and October 7th really brought it to the forefront, Julie, and I don't want to dwell on it. It's important, and it happens to be the pivotal moment that for many people brought into focus something that they didn't want to have in focus, that they didn't want to deal with. And now they're forced to because these events happened. And that is, how do we respond? How do we respond to those things? So we talked off camera a little bit, and I'm just going to reiterate some of that. What I want our viewers to know, it's a difficult conversation. I was in London in my hotel room 2 hours before I went on stage when the news feeds started coming in of what was happening, and especially at the Nova Music Festival. And so I saw that America was asleep because of the time difference. They were, I think, 7 hours behind. When I got back to the hotel room that night, I started watching the U.S. I don't usually watch TV, but I tuned into the networks to see what was going on. And here's what I saw, Julie. The news feeds that America was allowed to share with everyday people was very different from the news feeds originally coming out of the Middle East, out of Eastern Europe, out of Asia. And the reason I'm saying this is because America has not been allowed to see the truth of what happened on October 7th. Part of that is politically driven narrative. Part of that is the social media algorithms will not allow, for community guidelines, they won't allow the images. The net result is we have a generation of young people who say that the atrocities never happened. They're saying if they did happen, we would have seen them. Or if they did happen, why don't we know about them? And so they are now not having that information. They are making choices in their lives and publicly protesting in ways that don't make a lot of sense. It makes sense to them based upon this skewed and distorted information that they were given. And to some degree, that's happening to all of us. We are all casualties to some degree because we are not really being allowed to see. We're seeing distorted views of what happens in Ukraine, of what's happening at the Texas border right now, of what happens socially. And all of this is dividing. It's breaking the social bonds that have held our families together for generations, that have held our communities together, our societies, and ultimately our nation. So we have become a very divided nation because the social bonds are being broken through misinformation, disinformation. And a lot of it, I believe, is intentional because there is an effort to create a more vulnerable society. And this has deeply spiritual implications. But when we don't have those social bonds, Julie, we are susceptible and vulnerable to the ideas and the policies of others that want to drive us in a certain direction. Right now, we're being driven towards centralization, toward control, loss of freedoms across the board. And a lot of it is coming from the UN. A lot of it is coming from other organizations linked to the UN. We can do a whole conversation on that. Everybody knows. I'm not saying anything anybody doesn't already know. The point is we have to deal with it. This is what's up for us every day in our lives. And what I have found in my community, for example, I'll just take the atrocities in Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine, because the war crimes are happening there as well, or the war crimes that are happening in the Middle East, in Israel. What it does, Julie, is it triggers something deep within us. And the management of the information triggers very precise reactions. Primal instincts are triggered when we see women and children abused and killed. Primal instincts are triggered when we see helpless families and the elderly. And we then want to react. And what's happening, my friends, some of them you have on this program, other authors that people know, they don't know what to do because they are feeling an anger, they're feeling a hate, they're feeling rage, they want revenge in some cases, based upon the narratives that they're being shown. So what do we do with that? How do we deal with that in a healthy way? What I have found, and this is where it is a really deeply spiritual conversation, is it's less about how we respond and more about what we become in the presence of that response. Do we allow what we see in the media to make us into something that we would never choose to be in a million years? Do we allow the narrative that has been carefully honed to trigger us? Do we allow that to reduce us to this primal instinctual level where we lash out in hate and anger and revenge? And we have to ask ourselves, when we feel those reactions, which are perfectly normal human reactions, they're being engineered. When we feel those, we have to be honest with ourselves and say, is this information making me into something that I don't want to be? Is it making me become? Because we are not healthy when we go through our day carrying the hate and the anger and the feeling for the need for revenge. So when we find ourselves in those reactions, we have to ask, are we reacting from the love of what we know is possible and true in our lives, or are we reacting from the hate or the fear of what that information is triggering within us? And the answer to that question then takes us to the next steps in terms of what we need to do. If we find ourselves being triggered in fear, where does that fear come from? How could something halfway around the world incite fear inside of us in our homes? What is it lighting up? What fear in our lives has never been resolved? What trauma has never been resolved? And I'm not saying it's good, bad, right, or wrong. This is where we are right now in our world, because there's so many events and so many atrocities that are happening. When we respond, are we going to respond in a healthy way? So now there are some people I've had, there's the argument about the inner warrior. Do you fight or do you turn the other cheek? And for me, I think it's less about what we do again, and more about what we become. If we choose to fight, whatever that means, if it's a kinetic fight or if it's a social media fight, if it's a verbal confrontation, whatever it is, does that come from the love of those behind us, our family and our loved ones, or does it come from the hate of those that we perceive to be our enemies? Do we fight from the love of what we know is possible or from the fear of what happens if we don't? And there's a lot of narratives out there about fear, inciting fear in people, that what you're seeing happening over there can happen right here. So it's an important conversation. It's difficult because there are so many other narratives and so much baggage that come with it. But on the ultimate deeply, I'll ask your permission. Do I have your permission to go to the ultimate deeply spiritual level? Are you okay with that?
Oh, I'm like waiting for it. Yeah,
all right. So
please.
I think all of this, although it is current in our lives now, is actually part of something very ancient and very primal that has been with us from the very beginning. It's a battle between good and evil, not from a religious sense, but we live in a polarity world. And in a polarity world, both of those must be present. The question is, what do we identify with and what do we choose to dominate our world? And you're seeing that battle play out in media, in entertainment, in politics. You're seeing it play out kinetically in what happened at that Nova Music Festival and beyond. You're seeing it happen with what's happening in Ukraine. A lot of people don't know this. U.S. has boots on the ground. We're involved in wars, 22 wars on the planet right now. Most of them you never hear about. Most of them you never hear a word about. And all of them are carrying the same message. These events, Ukraine and what's happened in the Middle East, happen to be lighting it up for us front and center. And we have to choose. We have to make a stand. Do we identify with the evil or do we identify with the good? And what do we allow? What do we normalize in our lives and accept into our society? And again, it's a question we have to answer together. It can't be done for us. But it's difficult when the events are weaponized to divide us rather than used to bring us together in kindness so that we can work together to create a better world. That's a possibility, but that's not what's happening right now. And there's more of us than there is of they. We haven't even talked about who the they are, but there's more of us. We get to choose. And I think it's really important now, Julie, because I think you have a very sophisticated audience, and that's why I really enjoy coming on with your audience, because we don't have to start at ground zero every time. We can assume certain things are known and accepted. One of those is, I think we can all agree and assume that there's a new world emerging that's not quite here yet. And the old world that we grew up with, it's still there, but it's buckling and collapsing because it's unsustainable in its present form. So that new world's not here yet because we're still building it. I don't know everyone in your community or on this podcast, but I bet I know this about everyone. I would imagine anyone watching this does not want to carry the hurt from the world that we've known into that new world as the foundation of that new world for our children. We don't want to carry the suffering that we've known in the 19th and the 20th centuries and the Holocausts and the atrocities, humans against humans. We don't want to carry that into the new world. And it's up for us to heal right now. If we respond with hate and anger, doesn't mean we don't fight, but do we fight from hate and revenge, or do we fight from the love of what we know is possible in our lives, what we want for our children? That becomes that keystone or the cornerstone or the foundation of that new world.
How do we, and I don't mean this in a Pollyanna way, but like, how do we dive into that responding from love, knowing this is what's going on, creating that new world and also being aware that we're being fed a lot of fear and a lot of, as you said, meant to be vulnerable. And maybe I'll start there.
Well, I think, again, I don't think there's a single answer or a single solution. I think there are many answers. However, people are feeling drawn to respond, that's their choice. I think where the spirituality comes is being conscious of what drives that response. Am I responding because I'm afraid of the world if I don't, or what will happen to me if I don't? Or I'll just be very honest. When October 7th happened, I looked to our spiritual community, and you could hear a pin drop in the room because our spiritual leaders were absent en masse. And I've called some of them and I've talked to them. I'm said, where are you guys? Your community needs you to help them navigate what's happening here. Some of them have found that their teachings are shallow teachings. They're not bad and they're not wrong. They are just shallow. They're good time spirituality. And it's easy to be a spiritual person when the world looks rosy and rainbows. When something crosses your path, if your spiritual practice does not serve you, you have to ask, why is that? And what can I do to embrace a deeper spirituality? And some I know people that are struggling because their teachings are not serving their community in the face of what we're seeing happening in the world. It's a hard conversation, Julie, and it's very honest. It's a very honest conversation. Some of the spiritual teachers said they just can't see it. They said, I can't watch this. It's too hard. I talked to somebody that says, I'm just going to go to the beach and do my yoga. I can't deal with it. And we all feel like that sometimes. We have to take a break. But we're blessed to have a beach to go to do our spiritual practice. And some of our brothers and sisters are just trying to make it through the day. Yeah. And there are a lot of people in our community that are afraid to say anything because they're going to lose clicks on YouTube. They're going to have people unsubscribe. They know they're going to catch flack, and they don't want that flack. So they're just not saying anything. And all of those are choices. I'm not saying they're right, wrong, good, or bad. What I'm saying is we're a family and we're going through something, and we need one another, and we need one another's guidance and teachings and experience. And there isn't a single answer. I think there are many, many possibilities because we all learn differently. So I think what's really important for me, and it's my test, because I'm right there with you, and I'm right there with our community. When I hear something or I see something and somebody tells me, or it's on a video somebody sends me, or something like that, when I feel that primal gut response that makes me want to lash out, I have to ask myself, where's that coming from? Number one. And we all have an inner warrior, and it's there for a reason. I don't think it's just about complacency. I don't think it's just about turning the other cheek. We have to act sometimes. When we fail to act early on, when the signs of, in this case, evil are apparent, and we normalize that evil, then it becomes greater and greater and greater until the point where we have to act. We all saw this in World War II. If we had not acted as allies in the West, and we'd allowed Hitler to continue his conquest, we would live in a very different world today. So we had to act. So again, it's not that we need to not act, but on a spiritual level, what's compelling us to act? Right. We'll get through this, and there will be a time you and I have this conversation. All of this is in the rearview mirror. It's all already happened. The question is, what have we become? What kind of people have we become when this is over? And we have the opportunity now to become conscious and ask that question, consciously aware of what we're doing. And I know people that are reduced to the most primal, instinctive levels of pure revenge and hate, and they're allowing the hate to consume them. So hate has a chemical consequence. It kicks up the stress hormones in the body, high levels of cortisol, high levels of adrenaline that last day after day after day, not just for a short period of time. It becomes the filter, the lens through which they see all the events in life and all the events in the world. And they begin to lump categories of people together, and that hate begins to define other categories of people that have nothing to do with what's happening in the Middle East. I'm seeing that happen right now. And this is a spiritual exercise. Do we allow ourselves to succumb to that? Or can we draw a line and say we will not tolerate this level of evil because we love our world, we love our children, we love our future, and we love ourselves enough to draw the line and say this cannot be tolerated? What does it take? Now, what does it take to follow up, to make it clear that that evil cannot exist? So I don't know if any of that makes any sense. It's up for me as well, for a lot of reasons. I was supposed to be leading a group in Israel in November. This happened October 7th. And of course, I knew that we wouldn't be there in November. But all of our guides, our Palestinian guides, they text me, they're afraid. They think everybody's mad at them and people don't like them, and they want to take them off the face of the earth. And my Israeli friends, they don't know. They said, we don't know where this is going to go. We don't know what to do. This isn't us. This isn't what we want. Yet it's happening. And there's a lot of people in the world that want something more than this. So I think we're all being, I don't think it's a test. I think it's an opportunity to demonstrate our mastery in the world of what we choose and what we claim to be true in our hearts. People go around all the time, talking about how loving and spiritual and, everything else they are, and they probably are. Now the world has brought to our doorstep an opportunity to demonstrate the mastery of what we've claimed to be true. How do we implement that?
How do I come from love and do something that's going to actually create a new world that honors our family and love and good?
Well, now that goes to the deeper question, this fundamental battle between good and evil. People often think of a battle in terms of winning and losing. And if you think of a battle on that level, you're part of the problem. Because exactly. the idea of winning and losing is what keeps us stuck in the ancient trap of that polarity. Rather than winning, we have the opportunity to triumph, to transcend. That means to become more than the battle itself. How do you do that? If the battle between good and evil is to prevent us from celebrating our humanness, and ultimately that's what the battle is all about, then we triumph by doing just that, celebrating and living the deep truth of what it means to be human every day of our lives, by living the best version of ourselves, by loving without fear of the consequences of that love, sharing without fear our imagination, our creativity, the joy that we know is possible from the things that we envision and bring to fruition and create in this life. It can be art, it can be music, it can be community, it can be growing a garden, it can be creating a peace in a community, because there are forces out there that are pushing for just the opposite. Forces out there right now politically that are pushing us centralized community rather than localized community. They want centralized everything, centralized banking, they want centralized, they're discouraging rural living because they don't want people to be self-sufficient. They want people in what are called 15-minute cities. And there are some model cities that have been built in Saudi Arabia right now. They're some of the first places in the middle of the desert, and they're not places that I would want to live in, where everyone lives the same and innovation and creativity is discouraged. Everyone is dependent upon a centralized authority for food, for water, for their existence. that flies in the face of human nature, of human sovereignty, of human freedom. And this is where these ideas, there's a fine line between the ideas themselves and the spiritual implementation. And then the politics come in, Julie, because they're creating the policies and the laws that determine how we live our lives, or how limited and how much our lives are limited. So if you look closely, you don't even have to look at every one. Just look at the principles that are being proposed right now. Do they foster freedom, sovereignty, and creativity, or do they foster control, contraction, and homogenization, everything being the same? And the answer to that question for you, or whoever's asking the question, will tell you where those policies are going. And they're being driven largely by people that we never elected to represent us. Unelected people and organizations. UN is part of that. Not the whole UN. There are good people and good policies in the UN, but there's a part of the UN that is not like the UN used to be, United Nations. And they are full steam ahead on what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals they want to meet in 6 years by the year 2030. The only way, the goals are beautiful, Julie. If you go to the website and you read the goals at face value, who wouldn't want those goals? Like end poverty, end disease in the world. I mean, who doesn't want that? Now you read the fine print. How will they accomplish those goals? It is horrendous. It's not the world I want to live in. It sounds like a world out of 1984, a world where everything is digitized, everything is controlled, people are digitized. We lose the opportunity for self-expression, creativity, imagination, compromise a lot of our sovereignty to accomplish those goals. And it's a lot of people don't even know that it's happening to us, and a lot of people don't even know that these things are out there. So this is an example of where deeply spiritual principles are being challenged by policies that determine how we live our lives and how our children live their lives, and our ability to share and instill within our children values that we cherish, but those values don't fit into this vision. So when we live the best version of ourselves, what we're doing is what Buckminster Fuller said so beautifully before he passed in the early 1980s. He said, you're never going to change the world by fighting against the things you don't like. He said, you want a new world. He said, find a new way that makes the old way obsolete. People will follow the new way and the old way will collapse. The new way is to live the best version of ourselves, the deep truth of what it means to be human, and to celebrate that, because those are the qualities that are being challenged, and some people want to defeat those qualities. They don't like, this is another conversation on what's called the transhuman movement. Trans means beyond. The movement to replace our biology with technology that steals from us our humanness. And there's a place for transhumanism in our lives. There are beautiful technology that's being developed. For example, this is in the news today, so we can talk about this. There is, FDA has approved a computer chip to be placed into the human brain that allows us to communicate with our computer with no cables. You can communicate with your keyboard, no cables. Young people say, man, that's sweet. I can do my games with no cables. I can do the games with my mind. What's wrong with that? The flip side, and whether we're talking about computer chips in the brain, chemicals in the blood, replacing our immune system, sensors under the skin, replacing our senses, is that the way the human body is made, Julie, is that our uniqueness, our abilities begin to atrophy when they're not used. Mm-hmm. When neurons are replaced with computer chips, when an immune system is replaced with chemicals, when senses are replaced or logic is replaced with AI, then our cells, because there's no demand for them to be used, our body begins to say, oh, well, maybe you don't need this function anymore. And so it begins to atrophy in one generation. Next generation, which is just a baby away, next generation says, oh, that's something we used to do, but we don't need that anymore. And pretty soon, the things, those abilities that we took for granted, we've lost. And this is how you lose a species. It's exactly how you lose a species. Ray Kurzweil is an amazing visionary author. He's an engineer. He's a very good engineer. He is a director at Google Technologies, working with a lot of the AI. And what he says is that by the year 2035, which is within most of our lifetimes, he said all of us will be a hybrid species. We will all have technology implanted in some way to some degree, whether it's an RFID chip in your hand like they're doing in Norway, or it's a computer chip in the brain, or it's chemicals in the blood. We will all be a hybrid species. I personally think that that's wrong. And I personally believe that we need to tell our young people that there's something so rare and ancient and beautiful and precious and sacred about the human body that it's worth preserving. We don't even know fully what it means to be human because we're still exploring the new frontiers of neuroscience. For example, we are on the precipice of giving our humanness away before we even know what we're giving away. And that's all part of this movement for conformity so that we can meet those goals, those 2030 development goals. So how do you, I don't like to use the word fight. How do you counter that? You counter that by celebrating your humanness, by having children. They are telling us now that the act of conceiving a child is obsolete. They're saying because nobody knows what that child is going to be, you're taking a chance. Why not do it in the laboratory where you can engineer the hair color, the eye color, the IQ, fast twitch muscles for athletic performance? And so this is one of the levels where they are actually indoctrinating young people into believing that this is something that technology triumphs over human intimacy. All of this is up for us right now. So it's not about making somebody wrong, and I would never want to do that. It's about an awareness of the pressures to conform to a way of thinking that steals from us those things that we cherish the most, and that's humanness and life itself. And the way you counter that is to live your best life. You live whatever that means it's different for everybody, but celebrate our humanness, our creativity, our imagination. Don't take those things for granted. Learn new things, create new things, imagine new things, and bring them into the world fearlessly because you love what the potential is. And don't be intimidated by a system that is now telling us that we shouldn't be doing those things.
How do you honor the sacredness of each of us, the creativity, the unique gifts, the fact that there's going to be no other expression of you or me or anyone listening ever again as yourself? Putting past lives aside, no way you're going to be this person ever again. And I really resonate with your message. Well,
so we're all seeing this. The world is changing faster than we could document it in the textbooks or in the classroom. We are not conditioned to accept the degree of change that we're being asked. We can do it. We can adapt if we know how, but we've never been taught how to do this. Mm. And rather than looking and talking about each one, good, bad, right, or wrong, whatever it is, look at the big picture and ask yourself the question, are the policies that I'm being asked to embrace or the laws that I'm being asked to support or the narrative that is coming to me and my family and my kids, does it support freedom, sovereignty, creativity, imagination, or does it foster centralized power, control, and a loss of freedom and contraction of my spirituality. And when you hold every conversation to that bar, doesn't mean you have to act on it, but it gives you a good insight. It's a tool. It gives you an insight to know where the push is, what we're being driven to, and we have a choice. We can choose. And I think that we as a species are worth preserving. I think that our freedoms and our society, I'm going to make a distinction, and it's a whole conversation we could have about America. I believe that the idea of America is rare and precious and sacred. And when you understand the history of how the country was founded, the thinking, where that thinking came from, America was given something that no other nation has ever been given, and if we lose it, no other nation will ever give its people the freedoms that we're given. And I've had this conversation with young people, Canada, Australia, Europe. They say, what's the big deal about America? We can do everything you guys can do. And the answer is, yes, you can, until you cannot. Because your government can take those things from you. What sets America apart is our founders said, by virtue of us being alive, breathing, and walking this earth, there are qualities that come with that are imbued by virtue of our existence. The government didn't give them to us, and that means the government can never take them away. Free speech is one of those. The right to defend ourselves is another one, and there's a whole list of them. So the idea of America, I think, is worth preserving. The implementation, as we see it today, is broken. It is deeply flawed. And many people cannot make the distinction between those two. They want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over. And I'll tell you, if we ever relinquish those freedoms, if we ever do that, no nation will ever give to its people the freedoms that we have been given, because you cannot control a population with those freedoms. So I think the idea of America is worth preserving, recognizing the flaws, the deep flaws and the deep broken nature of how those freedoms have been abused. But it's not the freedoms, it's the way they were implemented. Yeah. And I think that is up for all of us right now. And they're very difficult conversations, very difficult decisions. So you need to have a yardstick by which you gauge all of those. And for me, this is where I come down on this. It's not about personalities. I can like the personality of the people wonderfully, listen to their words. Do they foster sovereignty, freedom, imagination, creativity? Do they allow my soul to soar and sing and me be the best version of myself to celebrate my humanness? Or are they contracting, taking those away, centralizing power and control that benefits them, it doesn't benefit me? And then that tells us what we need to know.
Was this something predicted earlier on? Are there texts you would recommend, or you say go to here to, like, I found that with the Tao Te Ching, but where can we find some of this direction and spiritual sustenance for those seeking?
Well, it's a big question. And I think there are many answers, because everyone learns differently. Depends on what level you choose to engage in the systems that our lives require us to be a part of. On what level do you choose to engage? The deep spirituality, almost every indigenous tradition tells us that there is a fundamental, they call it a battle between good and evil, playing out, where the evil doesn't always show up the way you would expect it to show up. It can show up as the stealing of sovereignty and freedom, or the desire to remake. Our young people, for example, are being told in schools today that we are flawed by virtue of our existence, that the human form is flawed in its nature, that among our flaws, emotion that clouds our logic is a flaw. but that technology can remove that emotion so our decisions are better. We're being told that love is a flaw because of the passion people will kill in the name of love, and they're saying that's a flaw. We're being told that the biological conception of babies, what we talked about earlier, is a human flaw because it's so imprecise. We have technology to fix that. So our young people are being taught that they are flawed in their nature, that all human life is flawed, and that we need something outside of ourselves to compete in business and to be successful in life. And that something is technology. So young people that come to our programs, and they're good people, they believe that they are flawed as beings, and they worship, Julie, they worship AI. They worship the computer. So let me just say something to our community about this, because as a scientist, I'm fascinated by this. I mean, I grew up in high tech. I went in the 1980s. I was working Star Wars Defense, SDI. The most advanced computer systems, laser systems, communication systems, radar systems. And I have yet to see any technology built outside of our bodies that doesn't mimic what we already do inside of our bodies in some way, including blockchain technology that is the basis for all the crypto that young kids are looking at. That blockchain technology mimics the way that DNA stores information. Transparent, immutable, long-lasting. It's going to be there. It's permanent. So blockchain technology actually mirrors that. So the reason I'm saying this is because our young people are being taught they need something outside of their bodies. Are computers fast? Yes. Absolutely. Are they efficient? You bet. They could do lots of calculations very efficiently. But here's the thing that people miss. A computer chip is limited in its function by the physics of the stuff it's made of. So if it's a silica-based computer chip, information will never be able to move between one atom of silica and another any faster than the physics of silica allow, and it tops out. That is an upper limit, and it maxes out. Can't go any further than there. What is the limit of a human neuron? Or what is the limit of a human cell? And the answer is we don't know. Because every time we push a neuron to what we think is the limit, the accepted limit of the past, we adapt, and now we exceed that limit to become something else. The perfect example used to be when scientists studied brain states. 40 hertz, 40 cycles per second used to be the top. I have textbooks that show the frequency of human brain, 40 hertz maxed out. They said the human brain can never process any faster than 40 cycles per second. Then the Tibetan monks came along, and they said, well, if we do a certain kind of meditation, we can exceed that. And they then pushed from 40, they doubled that. They went to 80 cycles per second. Scientists said, okay, well, we were wrong, but the human brain could never process faster than 80 cycles per second. They had to have new brain states. They went from, they had to create the gamma brain state. Then they had to create the hyper gamma brain state, because then they went to 80 cycles per second. Then they went to 100 cycles per second. And then the scientists said, well, we'll never exceed that. And the monks and the nuns, they said, well, if we do this certain meditation, then they went to 200 cycles per second. But not only that, on the other end, they had to create the lambda brain state on the upper end. They had to create the epsilon brain state on the lower end, because they were able to slow the brain down to less than 1 cycle per second, 0.1 hertz, where many people would think that you're no longer alive. Wow. But they're very alive in that brain state. And what it does for me, it makes me wonder how many people have registered a low brain state and doctors gave up on them, when in fact it could be, I'm not saying in all cases, because there are other extenuating factors, but it could be a deeply healing brain state where the activity is lowered to such a degree that the brain goes into a mode. In other words, the energy is not going to the brain. The brain's sending the energy to the rest of the body for healing. So it's like in standby mode, if you want to think, or when the computer goes to sleep, you close your Mac and it goes to sleep, conserving energy it's using for something else. So the point of this is we don't know what the top end of human performance is, because every time we think we reach it, we adapt and exceed that. And you can't do that with technology. So we're only beginning to understand what it means to be human. And I think we owe it to ourselves to embrace our humanness before we give it away to technology, because once it's gone forever. And so all of this is part of the same conversation. There's a vision to move the world in a certain direction, but you and I were never asked. Our community was never asked. The only way to accomplish those goals is with a level of social engineering that betrays our truest nature, our sovereignty, our freedom, imagination, creativity. So now the effort to reduce those things and indoctrinate young people, they don't think independently anymore. They have to use machines to do simple math. If you go to a Walgreens, for example, drugstore, and the electricity, the computers are down, they don't know how to make change unless they've got that computer there to tell them how to do that. They've lost that ability. And all of it comes back to the way that we think of ourselves and see ourselves. And even if you're not into all the other stuff we're talking about, you say, oh, that's crazy stuff. The bottom line is that we are given the opportunity now to live the deep truth of what it means to be human, the best version of ourselves, and to celebrate that, Julie, to celebrate all imagination, creativity, innovation, freedom, sovereignty, to celebrate those. And by doing that, what we're doing is it's actually a countermeasure against the movement, but you don't have to even know that. All you have to do is just live the best version of yourself with love. And I think that's important for all of us to know that.
Quick question, just as you were talking about the idea of good and evil, I've a lot of what's covered here, we talk about ego versus coming from heart. And it might be, I'm thinking for those, sometimes I can actually hear questions that are coming up. To me, there's something about this that also has that aspect in it too. Like, maybe you can share about that, ego versus heart.
I probably see personally, because I've asked myself the same question. Yeah. I think that the ego is the part of us that can be co-opted by evil forces, but the ego is not evil in and of itself. I know there are a lot of people that demonize the ego. When I think of evil is anti-life. And when we see atrocities that humans create, assuming that they are humans, have created against other humans, and it happens in war frequently, it's an aspect of war. The only way that one human can do the things to another human that we know have been done, whether we're talking about, World War II and the Holocaust, or we're talking about Vietnam that was happening there, or we're talking about Ukraine, or we're talking about Israel, is to dehumanize the other person, to stop seeing them as a human life. And that is evil. The evil is anti-life. Anything that stifles or steals life from a living being, stifles the freedoms and the creativities. That is how evil expresses itself in our lives. And deception is a big part of this. It's very easy to be deceived on the surface by forces and individuals that succumb to those forces, because they say one thing, or they are attractive, or they have a good personality. But then you look at what they do and how they do it. You talk to the people that live with them day in and day out, maybe their staff, that sees them when they're challenged and how they respond to what life brings to their doorstep. And it is very revealing in terms of, and we see this happen all the time, because they're not living what they speak. And I think evil plays out in a lot of ways, but we are, as a scientist, what I can say is there are many systems that tell us we are living the close of a cycle, a great cycle of time. That cycle is a geologic cycle. It's a cosmological cycle. There are cosmological events that are triggering events on our planet. There are magnetic field cycles. There are climate cycles. There are cycles of human conflict. There are financial and economic cycles. All of them are converging right now. So I am not surprised to see that evil and forces of evil would rear their ugly heads in a last attempt to accomplish as much as they choose to accomplish before the end of the cycle. Accomplish as much evil, steal human divinity. Divinity, we haven't talked about. Divinity is, if you look at the definition of divinity, it surprises a lot of people. It simply is our ability to transcend perceived limitations. That's the definition of divinity. To transcend, not just survive, but to become more than perceived. They may not even be real, but are perceived limitations. So divinity is what we've talked about, just didn't give it that name. It's the best version of ourselves. When we transcend our perceived limitations, we are living our true humanness. All right. And the goal of evil has always been to steal that divinity from us so that we don't live the full potential of our humanness, that we don't express our love, our creativity, our imagination, our innovation. So I am not surprised that as we close this cycle, and by definition, the end of one cycle is the beginning of what comes next. As we birth a new cycle, that we would see the polarity of evil making a last gasp, a last stance to accomplish that goal, to steal as much divinity as possible. That's not scientific. And as a scientist, I will say when I deviate from the science, I just deviated from the science. Mm-hmm. It is my sense from spending time with indigenous cultures all over the world. This is the 42nd year I've done this work now, one form or another. Spent a lot of time with the monks and the nuns in Tibet and the sadhus in Nepal, the curanderos that we see in the Yucatan, and the shamans in Peru and all through the desert Southwest. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, they actually identify our time in history as a time of a battle between the sons of darkness and the sons of light. And it was the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls that was discovered was the war. It's called the War Scroll. And it's a relatively complete scroll. All kinds of prophecies. Edgar Cayce talked about this. Nostradamus talked about this time in history. Dolores Cannon has talked about this time in history. Cryon talks about this time in history, depending on where you want to go. So there are a lot of indications that this is no ordinary time in history. And that's why I'm not surprised that we would see evil surface in the way it does. And I think we have to draw a line and say we don't tolerate this in our society. Now, how we counter that, I'm not saying fight, but how it's countered, we have to determine as a society because we share this world. Yeah. But if we accept and normalize and brush it under the carpet and discount what we see happening, then we've deviated and we now accept that in our society. And now the next time evil rears its ugly head, then it doesn't seem so foreign because we've already accepted this degree of it in our lives. That's a whole conversation, maybe Gregg and Julie part 5 or something. I don't know. It's a deeply spiritual conversation and it triggers a lot of people. And I know that because there are so many predetermined values that this conversation pushes back on, encounters directly. And I fully embrace that, and would never try to convince or persuade anyone of anything. Yeah. If you're looking for a reason of why it looks like the world is coming apart at the seams, it's not spontaneous. There is a drive to push us into a way of living, into a world that has been defined publicly. It's not a secret. Go read The Great Reset, and you will see precisely what that world looks like. And it's not a world that appeals to me, or that I would want the children of this generation to ever have to experience. It looks like a science fiction world, and yet it's a world that's being implemented. If we don't know what it is that's happening, it's being implemented as we speak. So we have to claim the values that we cherish as a foundation to know how to act, and then implement those values with love rather than hate and fear. And I think that's our blueprint right there.
I just think, gosh, what's going through my head is, what a time to choose to incarnate for all of us. I've thought about that a lot. Like, wow, you really picked a really profound time to be here. And I was also, as I was looking at the word evil, I'm reminded, I'm sure you've seen this, that the backwards spelling is live. And part of what I'm hearing, the message is the way to come at this is to live out loud, to live fully expressed, to live in your creativity, in your freedom, in your sovereignty.
Consciously.
Consciously.
With kindness. To live with a deep awareness of how your choices influence and affect other people. When you speak, what is the intent of the words you're about to share? Yeah. Are they to empower another person, or are they to make you right in an argument? Are they to show your superiority, or are they to foster a deeper appreciation for life in another person? I mean, those are the kinds of things that are expressions of life and love and humanness. Just the opposite now is happening through technology. People fire off the words with no face behind them on a Twitter or on a text that have deeply hurtful consequences, and sometimes to the point where people will take their lives. Kids will take their lives based on the opinions that other kids have shared without ever having the face present. They're just words on the text. Yeah. And we know that. So I think kindness is a big part of, and empathy for what this means to another person.
Yeah.